Okay, so this is my little presentation for time orientation. Sorry I couldn't give it to you in class, but this will do, hopefully. I'd like to start this off by asking you to ponder what you believe, what you know about time in general, and then particularly in the abstract, right? What can we say in lay terms about culture and time, for example? Maybe you are familiar with CPT or uh, some people call it Latin time. So those kinds of things. But what do we know more generally? So just to review, we always talk about the intermental, intramental, and how development is socially constructed, and what develops therefore reflects the culture in which it has been developed. Now, one of the reasons I find the time orientation part of this so interesting is because it doesn't necessarily jibe that well with our thinking about time, right? Because time can seem like something that's not negotiable, right? Like saying math is not culture bound. Math skills, how you learn, but maybe not math itself. And I think people's sense of time is often um, rigid in that way. But is time negotiable? So we start with the definition: sequential arrangement of events or intervals between events. Um, we can look at time and examine it on a few different levels. Um, for example, we can think about physical time, psychological time, philosophical time, scientific time, and biological time. um, and we might like to think that only the last four are amenable or shapeable by culture, assailable to culture. But in fact, that is making some presumptions about the nature of time itself, assumptions about physical time. In reality, there are actually competing views about even the nature of physical time, or time at its core. For example, one view is that time is part of the fundamental structure of the universe, a dimension in which events occur in sequence, and time is a thing that can be measured. That's the realist view, or Newtonian time. But there's also a competing or a contrasting view that rather than being an objective thing to be measured, time is actually just a measuring system that we humans use, right? So in this view, time is not an entity that flows, not an entity that objects move through, nor is time a container for events, but rather something of our minds, elements of the intellectual structure that we impose upon our events and the intervals between them, um, in order to make sense of the world around us, right? So you can think of this river image as a simplification of the sort of dominant view of time, the sequential view where it's passing and flows forward only like a river. But that's not the only possibility. For example, one way that we check about whether things like this are universal or if they're culture bound is we look for just a single case where it's different, and then that sort of is a demonstration that it doesn't have to be the way we look at it. And so Benjamin Whorf's studies of the Hopi language serve as that case for this issue. Um, the Hopi view sees the world and time as cyclical, not linear, round, not flat. And so and on further studying, this wasn't like a limitation of their language or some other such thing, but actually a very different intuition about time, right? Their language does include tenses, but they're manifested and becoming manifested. And even those words are short of quite capturing what is meant by that. But we can, do our best to sort of translate it into English. Manifested includes all that is and ever has been, whereas becoming manifested includes things which are not physical, right? So Whorf concluded that they don't include tense in their sentences because they have a different conception of time than other groups of people. So working from a different worldview principle that sees only cyclical, not linear time, the Hopi provide that sort of example case of a different possibility altogether. Most of the world's grammars have emerged from the Latinate mold, and the Germanic molds show the particular time tense that we're used to, but in fact it's peculiar to Western European languages, and so you have this linguistic cultural ontology of time as we know it, but not a supposed universal as we have been taught to believe. This next image is not really necessarily a good illustration of cyclical time, but it certainly reminds me, or it's how my brain tries to wrap itself around this idea of manifested and becoming manifested. But that's me imposing that. Maybe Hopi speakers wouldn't get much out of it. But anyway, this is representing the synchronic view of time, that time is an interrelated past, present, and future. It works out good for sci-fi. Think of it this way. Another illustration of something like cyclical time. And then, of course, there's hammer time. And I fully know that y'all are way too young for this joke, but it amuses me, so I don't care. And maybe this will amuse you. Oh no, no audio though. Let me try and get it to play. I hope you were amused. Anyway, in psychology, the two perspectives have been subdivided, or maybe they each manifest in terms of 7 issues relating to time as it is lived and contested. We can think of those dimensions of time as clock time versus event time, punctuality questions, polychronic versus monochronic time, work versus leisure time around time use values, past, present, and future orientations, and short and long-term orientations, and time metaphor. What is the symbolic meaning and value of time? So let's start with clock and event time. If people in a culture behave according to clock time, this means that they are careful about the times of scheduled appointments. They make sure that their watches are running on time and become irritated if others are careless about time as it relates to meetings and other events. If people in a culture behave according to event time, then they may organize themselves and their days around events and participate in one event until it reaches its natural conclusion before beginning another event. Therefore, with less deference to what the clock is instructing them to do. Clock time is typically found in North America, Western Europe, kind of the usual suspects on our cultural differences, or event time, South America, South Asia, Africa, again, the usual suspects. Usual suspects. Little anecdote, one semester every Tuesday I had a meeting that overlapped with one of my classes a little bit, and I was always amazed at the pressure that I sensed from my colleagues. Not that they wouldn't quite say I should let class out early, but you could see how it registered in them what time I did show up, right? So like as if I should be there at 12:16 even though my class finished at 12:15. But I usually arrive more like 12:35 because I don't want to run out on students if they want to talk to me, if they have something to chat about. I also believe there are exchanges that we have at the end of a big class discussion that are related to the time we've just spent together and that aren't really going to come back around. Right? They're not pressing or important enough to ask me again 2 days later or come to office hours, but would be very meaningful in that short period after the class. And so I just kind of allowed myself to be a little late to these meetings. But a brother needs a job, so on some occasions where I had to give a talk or some other appearance to the administration, I did leave early. I felt bad about it because, if you may have guessed, I have more of an event time orientation. And so one of the things you can see is that at least some people shift in the way that they manage their time across periods of time. I want to add something to this sort of definition, which is lifted out of an article. And countries with developing economies where the necessity of attention to clock time is not yet fully part of people's work habits. So we've been working on this all semester. I want you to be able to pick out the problematic in that last little phrase that came at the end of this listing. I hope you'll see it as this optimality assumption, the assumption that that which is Euro-Western is obviously better and more advanced. That's nested in that language there. Moving on to punctuality. One of the ways to think about that is to ask this question: if an event is scheduled at 9, what time does it usually start? Now, we might acknowledge some variability between a business meeting versus dinner plans versus a wedding versus a house party. But some research on people travelers to different countries found that they get really frustrated and around the differences around punctuality. So if a business meeting is called at 9, what time are people late, right? In the Euro West, people are late if they, and would have to apologize and call attention to themselves if they entered the room more than about 3 or 4 minutes late. Whereas in other places that might not be the case. My father-in-law is famously a very time-centered person, despite being from and living in Africa. And I remember the first time that he ever took me out on an outing. This is while I was courting my wife. I was warned that he was very time-oriented, and then for some reason he set an appointment with me, like some random spot in the city that I had to find in my little rental car in the city that I didn't know. And I remember because I arrived, let's say the appointment was at 11. At 11, I crossed the intersection. I saw him standing on the corner, and I managed to wave so that he saw me. And I was so proud of myself because I made it. I made it on time. He will not think ill of me. Sometime later, I found out he considered me rather late because I had still to park and then walk over to where he was. And it was disrespectful in his mind for me not to have been standing there shaking his hand at exactly 11 o'clock. Just as, an example, an anecdote. So in some cultures, it's acceptable to be early, but even then it's impolite. You're supposed to come on time, and it's never acceptable to be late, requiring an apology with the reason for tardiness, and you will be judged if you are late. If you're inconsiderate, you are unreliable, and you don't respect people, or you would not be late. That's certainly one way to think about it. But you can also imagine the level of stress that creates, right? So if you live in most urban places, but even in the suburbs, and you're late at 9:02, you can think about, like, when you think about traffic and weather conditions and all the things that influence a life. Basically, most of us live our whole lives multiple times a day worrying about being late. I know that I certainly do. And think about what the physical effect of that is, right? So when we are worrying about being late or whatever, that's stress. We're going to have cortisol release. We're going to have all these physical sort of responses to that, none of which are especially good for you in the long term, right? And it's simply not the only possibility. That's what's important, right? Just a little side story on Peru. They actually announced that they were going to stop this business of mañana and being, sort of slow and late. And one of the first steps to that was to, at one particular moment, they were going to ring the church bells according to the international timestamp so that everyone could get their clocks right. And this was going to be their way of sort of getting away from being late at all times. By contrast, if you're an event time person, you kind of started agreed to a meeting at 9, but then at 8:50, one of your superiors or one of your workers came over, and there was an event that needed to be resolved, and it would be allowed to proceed to its completion because there's a person standing in front of you who needs your attention, right? And that is what is the focus, right? The person or the task or the event at hand gets your attention, and everyone would expect this and know this and understand it and would behave in the same way. Therefore, there would not be judgments. It would not be seen as disrespectful. You might offer an apology just to be kind, but if you didn't, it still wouldn't necessarily be seen as disrespectful. It's a very different way of thinking about seeing time. But if you think about that whole "you were late, therefore you don't respect me" thing, that is driven by the person deciding that, right? Um, and in that sense, cultural. So we can think about time management practices. Um, there are a couple measures out there of time management practices, so you could just ponder your own answers to these questions. I do not like to juggle activities at the same time. People should not try and do many things at one time. When I sit down, I work all on one project at a time, or I'm comfortable doing several things at the same time. This is from a measure of poly versus monochronic time, which is another sort of way of thinking about time management differences, by Hall. And it refers often to how many activities are performed within the same time block, perhaps seemingly at the same exact time. So monochronic time takes place when activities are performed one at a time, and people who have strong monochronic tendencies are typically thought of any other stimulation, any other activity that tries to intrude is seen as that an intrusion or an interruption, rather than a combination or syncopation or any such thing. Whereas for polychronic time, you may do many things at a given period of time in a given setting. So polychronic time you can also think of as event time, or at least it's related, and he argued that it might be found more frequently in sort of the southern hemisphere. And hopefully you're picking up the relationship with stimulation preference and verve as we talked about it recently. Here's some definitions. Polychronic and monochronic time are divided into units and used in a linear way. You do one till you're done, you move to another. Whereas polychronic time, human transactions are emphasized more than holding schedules, so people work on various fronts simultaneously. And again, movement is more driven by people than with the clock. This is me relating polychronic time also to verve a little more, for no good reason. Well, some good reason. This image too, it just kind of reminds me of polychronic time. Having a multiple hands and being able to see and manage seems to characterize this statue. Polychronics have a circular view of time, and there's less pressure for immediate action or performance, and an emphasis on the present, whereas monochronic cultures have a linear view of time and creates pressure for action and performance, long-range goals, and planning. Now, former President Bill Clinton was fairly notorious for his multitasking, polychronic way of being, where it was taken evidence of his superior intelligence. There's an anecdote about him, watching golf and talking shit with his friends while an aide was trying to brief him, and the aide got irritated. Why you get irritated with your president is another question. And then Clinton rounded on him and repeated the briefing back almost verbatim, indicating that yes, he was listening, although he was also doing other things. Although most of the literature on multitasking actually assumes that it's a bad thing. So this lady in this cartoon is seen as the worse for wear for her multitasking. Even if, what she has done is seen as impressive, I'm sure you're not voting her Mother of the Year. Another way to think about it, another one on that list, is work and leisure time. So most people seek, quote, balance in the work and leisure, but what the appropriate ratio should be can be very different across cultures. For example, in kind of our culture and some others, vacation is a luxury. You aren't owed that, right? So the US and Japan are famous for long hours, long years. We have terms like workaholic and karaoshi, which is death through overwork in Japan. And they kind of symbolize people's general attitudes toward work. In other countries, vacations are considered a social right. Vacations are long. You might get 2 months or 3 months vacation. The world doesn't stop. Of course, we would defend by saying our GDP is better, but who knows if that's the right measure. Yes. There's my cheesy illustration of Karaoshi for some reason. As it relates to work and leisure time, I have this anecdote. One of my former students, the first time I taught this course was in a graduate course. This topic was in a graduate course. And after the lecture, the next day, I got an email from a student who'd missed class, and she was so upset. She said, I missed the discussion. Can we do it again a little? Because I need to express my frustration with putting happy hour in my calendar. I will someday leave Western civilization and go back to, quote, the third world because of the time issue. And then she reports on a conversation with a friend of hers. Hey, you want to go for a beer? Sure, let me get my purse. No. Can't just go for a beer. Let's schedule it. That cracks me up. Not sure why the formatting on that slide is weird, but hopefully it works. Now, for perspective, humankind in its entire history isn't even one bubble in the foam of that glass of beer. Right? So if you think about it, getting worked up in the ways that we do sometimes about 5 or 10 minutes seems kind of silly. Another way that scholars have examined time orientation is around pace of life, which is the importance people place on clocks, watches, and how fast people move, how fast businesses operate, etc. In some cultures, time is very serious. People rush to be punctual and so forth. In others, people put less emphasis and even move more slowly from place to place. And efficiency is not the driving force. There's an interesting research on whether people consider efficiency or effectiveness more important in taking care of a task. There's a study by Levine and colleagues who looked at people's pace of life through analysis of 3 factors, and they looked across 31 cultures. They looked at people's walking speeds in urban areas, measured with a stopwatch, the amount of time people had to wait online at the post office to get services, and then the accuracy of clocks in public spaces, including post offices, compared with international standards. And what they found was that in countries where the pace of life is fast and where time, according to these measures, was taken seriously, those countries ranked high in economic productivity as measured by per capita gross national product. There were like Switzerland, Germany, Ireland, England, countries where the pace of life was slower, showed agreement with sort of CPT and Latin time, mañana, etc. Places like El Salvador, Brazil, Indonesia, but they also had relatively low GDPs. But the fast-paced countries had higher indices of coronary disease as behaviors associated with fast pace of life, pressure of deadlines, necessity of demonstrating productivity as measured by output per hour, etc., seem to be causing stress-related illnesses such as heart disease and other negative implications for health, such as short lunch hours where you therefore eat crappy food. That's not very good for you, and you eat it too fast on top of that. Could also look at time orientation around past, present, and future to try and understand a culture's use and understanding of time, because, of course, cultures don't necessarily only have one orientation to the exclusion of others, and it's certainly rare for any culture to have only one of these, but there can certainly be relative differences in emphasis. Martin Luther King said this, which I think fits in nicely right here. I won't read it to you, I'll let you read it for yourself, but it has a very emphasis on urgency around questions of time. Not for nothing, I'm still waiting for my civil rights to properly be given to me, and some time has passed. So that's kind of a future orientation. Past-oriented cultures tend to take a long-term perspective and to be risk-averse. Those living in compared to future-oriented cultures where they do things routinely for their long-term future returns. For example, Chinese people are known for having a long-term perspective despite also being respectful for the past. And so they're known to plant slow-growing trees so that they can be ready for their grandchildren. Have you planted anything for your grandchildren yet? Um, Present-oriented cultures, on the other hand, emphasize the here and now and focus on short-term perspectives. And so time efficiency is important, and people are reminded not to waste time. I think the U.S. has a significant emphasis on this, right? So often we're trying to solve today's problem and put out today's fire that we actually knowingly create tomorrow's problems. But that's not what we deal with right now. Today we're solving today's problems, which, possibly not the best. I'm going to think about these colleges and all the things we do to put out fires without planning well into the future. Future-oriented cultures usually have long-term perspectives, right? People do things expecting future returns. The Chinese, the tree example, relatively longer period of times may take to get events started because you want to invest time in relationship building and preparation rather than just getting to the point. Within future orientation, we can examine the extent to which people adopt long-term versus short-term outlooks on the future of work, life, and other aspects of life and society. Pretty much talked about all that. Another way to think about it is relating to the symbolic value of time. Right? So we live in a very time is money metaphor kind of a culture, right? And some people internalize that. It's not hard to understand if you come from a clock time culture. You may put monetary value on time and treat it as a tangible commodity. After all, we pay people by the hour for their work, and we sometimes try to use money to buy time with money by purchasing gadgets or services that are meant to save time that we can then put to some other more profitable use, for example. So many people hire out to a significant extent the raising of their children in order to make more time to work. Um, that's a little glib, but not without any foundation whatsoever. But the monetary analogy doesn't apply to all cultures. For example, the common practice of paying an hourly rate for some kinds of services, such as babysitting or legal counseling, is not as common in some Asian countries where it would seem as vulgar to pay penny for such things. Not that you wouldn't, pay someone who helped watch your kids, but that you wouldn't pay them by the hour, because watching your kids is more than the time they spend with them. It would be also about, all that goes into spending meaningful influence on their lives. Some people also regard time as an indication of status. Levine suggested that the relationship between time and power might is illustrated in the rules of the waiting game. For example, we will wait a weirdly long time for a doctor, as if their time is inherently more valuable than ours. And it's because of how we function as a society, we actually may think that. Certainly we may not like it, but we don't do much about it. Time is also related to importance, right? So, for example, a task that we deem as more important, we will spend more time on, and people treat it that way. So you increase the time spent on some tasks and decrease time spent on others. If it's not significant, you want to make a quick decision and move on to more important matters. But if it's major and far-reaching, we're more likely to slow down and try to take more time to think it through and bring in more perspectives. Okay, so that was a blazing overview summary of ways that psychologists, but not only psychologists, think about how time orientation can vary culturally and otherwise. I'll just end you with another anecdote from a student. I find it really interesting how much this brings out of people when you talk about time orientation. You can tell we're not entirely comfortable with the way that we live it. One of my students who had traveled, worked abroad, wrote this to me: when I was working in Senegal, I learned that some older people give people different info about their travel to prevent spirits from causing them harm. So if someone arrives, they'll give different times to various people that are supposedly coming to pick them up to confuse the spirits. Anyway, so I'll end on that. I shall see you in class. Thank you for taking time to watch this.